In this video, we're going to talk about honesty as the rejection of unreality from Chapter 8 of Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. Stay tuned. So let's jump in with a summary of this section. So honesty we get is a refusal to fake reality. It's the refusal to engage in any form of pretense. And it's intimately connected to rationality. And if we think about the metaphysical basis of rationality, Leonard tells us it's really the idea that existence exists. And so the whole goal of rationality is I want to grasp what exists. I want to grasp reality. Whereas honesty is sort of emphasizing the other side of it. It's that only existence exists. And therefore, if you engage in pretense, if you engage in faking, it doesn't change the facts. And so now you've made reality your enemy, and that is going to be a self-destructive policy. That the pursuit of values that is conducted by embracing unreality is doomed to failure. I mean, you're going to war with the facts, and that's a war that you have to lose, because what success in reality commands is conformity to reality, conformity to the metaphysically given. And so you can think about honesty as it's accepting the primacy of existence. And it's saying that, yeah, I'm not going to try to invent an alternative. I'm not going to put my imaginations and my consciousness above reality. Then when we turn to the intellectual side of it, it's what honesty commands is intellectual honesty. And so it's striving to know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And so you can think about rationality as really focused on the truth and the whole truth. And then what honesty is really focused on is nothing but the truth. And Leonard breaks that down into its honesty in method, which is the idea that I'm striving to know what is true. So I'm not just passively going by whatever happens to be bouncing around in my brain. It's a real dedication to discovering the truth. And then in motive, you're discovering it because you're going to practice it, because you are going to follow in action what you conclude through the use of your consciousness. And then finally in content, it's not pretending to know things you don't know and not pretending not to know things you do know. It is, one way to think about it is that you're clear and not faking any distinction between what you know, what you don't know, and what you kind of sort of know. It's that you're really being honest about the cognitive status of what's in your mind. Existentially, it's that you're not going to pursue values by means of pretense. And that's precisely because it puts you at war with reality. We get the idea in which a single lie that you don't come clean on tends to lead to more and more lies in order to protect it, in order to cover it up, because any given fact is going to clash with other facts. And so to surrender honesty is going to put you at war with reality, and it's going to put you at war with every other virtue that remaining in reality requires. And we get a real focus on the issue of independence, so that a person who pursues values by means of dishonesty becomes dependent on others. And if you think about Peter Keating's form of dependence on Rourke, right? That's bad. Like, we see how it's destructive that he's substituting Rourke's judgment and Rourke's actual work for his. But with dishonesty, it's worse. It's dependence on, as Ayn Rand puts it, the fools you succeed in fooling. Or as Leonard points out, it's that you're dependent on people's ignorance, their gullibility. You're dependent on blindness. So it's like a self-made blindness being led around by the blind. And so it's the kind of worst form of dependence that you could actually imagine. Now, the next stage that we get is a contrast of the objectivist view, not just of honesty, but it's a broader discussion with what Leonard calls the trade-off view in ethics. And you can think of the trade-off view this way, which is that the trade-off view says, look, values are obvious. So, $1 million that you could get by robbing a bank, obviously the $1 million is good for you. It's just you have to do a cost-benefit analysis to think, well, do the benefits of the $1 million outweigh the negatives of getting caught? And Leonard's view, or his argument here, is that that is totally wrong. It's definitely not the objectivist perspective, that value is a type of fact. We saw this in our discussion of values as objective, and that in order to see something as a value, in order to grasp, yes, this is a value, you have to engage in a certain process. It's a process of objective evaluation, evaluation of something by a rational standard. And the only way to then establish that something is good is to go through that process, or as we saw in our discussion of man's life, to think in principle. It's to conceptualize the requirements of human survival and then see, does this particular value that I'm thinking of pursuing, does it fit within the principles that actually promote human life? And if it doesn't, it's out. And if it does, then you can think about, the costs and benefits. So that if it's, hey, I could gain $1 million by taking a job at this company, then you can think, all right, what are the positives of working there? What are the negatives working there? But if it's the issue of you're engaged in something that clashes with reality, neither, as Ayn Rand puts it, love nor fame nor cash are a value if the price is reality. That the last part is not an exact quote, but that's the kind of essence of her view. Or the way that Leonard puts it is, if in any form this potential value involves a denial of reason and reality, that ends the matter. Then we get a few clarifications about the idea of, do the ends justify the means, about honesty and altruism, about white lies. We'll talk more about that. But we end with a lengthy discussion of honesty as contextual, and more broadly that all virtues, all principles are contextual. And so it's just part of the wider perspective that knowledge is contextual. It's that we form these principles in a context, and they apply then in that context. Within that context that they're formed, they're absolute. So it's not that we choose things in a case-by-case basis, but there can be things that fall outside the context. And again, this is something we'll talk more about, but from the objectivist perspective, for instance, you can't jump from the idea of the principle of honesty to the idea that you should never lie, even if, to use the kind of Kantian example, there's a murderer knocking at your door, asking where his next desired victim is. So that's the summary of the chapter. Let's turn now to our MPI analysis. So the principle is, as obviously stated in the subhead, is honesty is a rejection of unreality. It's the refusal to fake reality. It's the refusal to engage in pretense. Then what we saw intellectually is that it's the dedication to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That existentially, it's never seeking to gain a value by putting yourself in conflict with reality, by going to war with reality, by faking in any manner whatever. And the basic harm is that because if you're pursuing a value by faking the facts, you're not dealing with the actual facts. And it's precisely dealing with the actual facts, dealing with existence, dealing with reality as it is. That is the key to being able to achieve values in reality. And then the metaphysically given fact that's involved here is there's only one reality. And this is the whole point of existence exists, and only existence exists. And so, one thing that, one implication of this is, people will sometimes ask, well, who denies that existence exists? And if you recall our discussion way back in one of the very early videos, that people do deny it by implication all the time. And one of the ways that they deny it by implication is precisely by pretense. Because what they're in effect doing is saying, yeah, there's an alternative to existence, and I'm gonna live in that reality. And what honesty is saying, what the metaphysically given fact it recognizes, that no, only existence exists. There is only one reality. So I want to situate our discussion of honesty in the larger context of the objectivist ethics, but I want to do so by bringing in the perspective that we get from Ayn Rand, not in Galt's speech, but in the objectivist ethics, in that essay in The Virtue of Selfishness. So in what we're doing is we're following the presentation in OPAR, which is following the presentation in Atlas Shrugged. And there what you get is that rationality is treated as the primary virtue, and then you have 6 derivative virtues. But that's not how she treats it in the objectivist ethics. In the objectivist ethics, she talks about the 3 primary virtues of objectivism as rationality, productiveness, and pride. And then independence, integrity, honesty and justice are treated as aspects of rationality. And I think you can see why she's carving out productiveness and pride as separate, is that they're uniquely focused on creation of values. So it's the creation of material values in the case of productiveness. It's the creation of the value that is your own soul with pride. And so then if we think about, well, what's being carved out by these different aspects of rationality? Why are they worth emphasizing? What are they bringing out? One way I really like that it's put in Alan Godhelf's chapter on the objectivist ethics in the Blackwell Companion is he talks about independence and integrity as kind of the backbone of rationality. And you can think about that as like, no, you need to be rational even when it puts you kind of in conflict or you're feeling emotional tugs in your relationships with other people, or when you're experiencing inner conflict or some form of temptation. It's that, no, you need to be rational even in those cases. And then honesty he calls, and this is really interesting, the monitor of rationality. And if you just think about it this way, how is it that people typically engage in rationality? It's very, very often made possible through dishonesty, through some form of faking or pretense. So it's not just, yeah, I'm going to refuse to face the facts and look at the facts. There is that kind of like just sheer evasion, but it's typically, what are you talking about? I'm not dealing with the facts. These are the facts right here. Only those facts are phony and made up. But it's, and you could even think is kind of a steely sort of mental experiment, but imagine somebody who said, like, I'm willing to engage in every form of irrationality, stealing, robbing people, killing them, any indulgence, any whim that I have, except for I just can't lie. Like, I refuse to lie. Like, you couldn't go that wrong. I mean, in the sense that it would kind of come to an end very quickly, because the whole issue with irrationality is that it's putting you in conflict with the facts, with cause and effect, if you want to think of it that way. And that what dishonesty is about is trying to avoid cause and effect. It's trying to get effects without causes or causes without effects. And so if you rob yourself of that tool, well, it kind of masks how hopeless that endeavor is. And you would see it much faster if you were on the principle of honesty. Or even if you were just on the principle of not telling lies, which, as we'll talk about, is not the whole of honesty by any means. Here's really interesting. I'm going to talk more about what other thinkers have said about honesty that I think overlaps in one way or another with Ayn Rand's view. But this is from Sam Harris in his book, Lying. He says, honesty can force any dysfunction in your life to the surface. Are you in an abusive relationship? A refusal to lie to others. How did you get that bruise? Would oblige you to come to grips with this situation very quickly. Do you have a problem with drugs or alcohol? Lying is the lifeblood of addiction. If we have no recourse to lies, our lives can unravel only so far without others noticing. And so I think this is part of the perspective from which you can think of honesty as the monitor of rationality. So I do, though, want to take a wider view of honesty and bring in other thinkers, because it's very interesting to see what others have grasped about dishonesty and to what extent it matches Rand's analysis and to what extent it departs. And in part, what I think is interesting about it is some of the things that I found challenging grappling with Ayn Rand's analysis are actually views that other thinkers have come to in one form or another, that it's not only her who is kind of caught on to these aspects of honesty and dishonesty. So in particular, I looked at Cecilia Bach, who wrote a famous book in philosophy circles called Lying. As I mentioned, Sam Harris has his book on lying. And then Jordan Peterson, his book, 12 Rules for Life, devotes an entire chapter to one of his rules is tell the truth or at least don't lie. And so Bach talks about the impact of lying on the liar. Because most people will get, I see the damage that dishonesty does to other people. Certainly, I don't want to be on the receiving end of a lie, but objectivism is upholding rational selfishness. And so part of what you need to be able to grasp is, well, how is it that a person who engages in lies isn't being self-destructive? And so these are three thinkers who are not egoists. They're not advocating selfishness. And yet they have a lot to say about the way in which you do yourself harm by engaging in dishonesty. So here's Bach. She says, how is the liar affected by his own lies? The very fact that he knows he has lied, first of all, affects him. He may regard the lie as an inroad on his integrity. He certainly looks at those he has lied to with a new caution. You're turning other people into threats versus potential benefactors. And if they find out he has lied, he knows that his credibility and the respect for his good word have been damaged. So Ayn Rand is going to go a lot deeper. It's that, she gets the way in which the dishonest person, she identifies the way in which the dishonest person becomes a pawn of others and becomes a pawn of them, as we talked about, in the worst way. It's a pawn of their blindness. But I think it's still that they can get that, like, this is really losing proposition for a person to engage in, because there's just these enormous costs that come from developing a bad reputation. If you just want to put it in that kind of common sense way, that, the liar's not really, if he, like we, said, it's not right to do a cost benefit analysis, but even if you think about it as a cost benefit analysis, like, the costs are enormous. And so, you need to really take those into account. And the dishonest person does not really take into account the costs of dishonesty. So what about this point that lies lead to more lies, that you get more and more into a war with reality? This is actually a really common theme, and all three of these writers that I mentioned talk about it. So here's Bach. The risks of lying are increased by the fact that so few lies are solitary ones. It is easy, a wit observed, to tell a lie, but hard to tell only one. The first lie must be thatched with another, or it will rain through. More and more lies may come to be needed. The liar always has more mending to do, and the strains become greater each time. Many have noted that it takes an excellent memory to keep one's untruths in good repair and disentangled. The sheer energy the liar has to devote to shoring them up is energy the honest man can dispose of freely. And my co-author on several of my books, Yaron Brook, often talks about this. And it's not the most fundamental perspective on honesty, that it's really hard work to keep your lies straight, but it's not irrelevant to getting it. It's if we think about the key to gaining values is your mind, that's your basic tool of survival, then using your mind not to know reality and not to deal with reality, but to juggle a bunch of lies that you've told, that is a real cost. That is doing real damage to yourself. And if you just put it as opportunity cost, is one way to think about it, it's enormous. That is kind of where the focus of your life is. Here, Sam Harris makes the same point. Lying unquestionably comes at a psychological cost for the rest of us. Lies beget other lies. Unlike statements of fact, which require no further work on our part, lies must be continually protected from collusions with reality. And so it's just that your time and attention, it's all being directed not to know and deal with reality, but to avoid reality. It's that you're putting in a lot of effort, and a lot of unpleasant effort, unless you're kind of like a really, you have to have a really twisted psychology to enjoy this sort of process. And it's not clear that there's many people at all who, even like real criminals and things, who experience it that way. One thing I always think of is, why do so many crimes get solved by confessions? It's because even people who do really bad things, there's a real relief not to be struggling in order to hide the facts and conceal the facts and cover lies with more lies. And there's a real relief from just saying, yep, these are the facts and I'll accept the consequences, even if the consequences are going to be negative. So now Rand's view, again, is going to go much deeper. So for her, it's that reality is all interconnected. And so we're ending up at war with reality. But even though Rand goes deeper, Bach has this really interesting observation about how this plays out that I found a really helpful addition to understanding that kind of causality. So she argues that, the lies change a person's psychology in a way that they won't feel guilty for lying. Like that can really happen. And yet, so it's not that the liar feels the same amount of guilt that other people, that you and I would by telling a lie, the person who's lying a lot. But that actually increases the risks to the liar. So, some of the arguments I've heard are, well, you can't talk about the guilt that a liar feels or the kind of the tension or the mental negatives. They get used to it and that's how they function. But she basically argues that, yeah, and that's one of the reasons why they're more likely to get caught and have everything blow up in their face. So she puts it as the ability to make moral distinctions can coarsen. The liar's perception of his chances of being caught may warp. And you definitely see this. If you think about these kinds of tabloid stories where some politician or some famous person has their kind of like secret life exposed, part of what you see is that there's this tendency over time where they become more and more reckless with their dishonesty or with whatever sort of bad behavior they're engaging in. And you have to think about the whole psychology of a liar and why that's likely to happen. That they have to lie to themselves in a really profound way. I can understand reality, other people can't. I'm smarter than everybody else. Because imagine if you really, and so that kind of brazenness that gets them caught comes out of that self-delusion. I don't have to be careful because look, I'm so smart, others are dupes, and I've gotten away with it so far. And if it really stood in your mind as the facts are the facts, they're out there to detect, I can't erase them, I can cover them up, but they're still there, and so in principle others can discover them, and other people are as smart or smarter than me, and so I can't even fully predict what kind of things would allow them to detect me. Like at a minimum, you would be super careful, but really, you couldn't hold all of that at the forefront of your mind and engage in dishonesty. And well, let me now bring in Jordan Peterson's analysis of this, which I think, like Rand's, goes really deep and actually has some observations that I think are really worth capturing here. So this is an extended quote, but I really liked it a lot. So he's describing the process of lies leading to more lies, and he says, first a little lie, then several little lies to prop it up. After that, distorted thinking to avoid the shame that those lies produce. Then a few more lies to cover up the consequences of the distorted thinking. Then, most terribly, the transformation of those now necessary lies through practice into automatized, specialized, structural, neurologically instantiated, unconscious beliefs in action. Then the sickening of experience itself as action predicated on falsehood fails to produce the results intended. If you don't believe in brick walls, you will still be injured when you run headlong into one. Then you will curse reality itself for producing the wall. After that comes the arrogance and sense of superiority that inevitably accompanies the production of successful lies, hypothetically successful lies, and that is one of the greatest dangers. Apparently, everyone is fooled, so everyone is stupid except me. Everyone is stupid and fooled by me, so I can get away with whatever I want. Finally, there is the proposition, being itself is susceptible to manipulations, thus it deserves no respect. And then just skipping ahead a couple paragraphs, he writes, tortured by constant failure, the individual becomes bitter. Disappointment and failure amalgamate and produce a fantasy. The world is bent on my personal suffering, my particular undoing, my destruction. I deserve, I must have my revenge. That's the gateway to hell. That's when the underworld, a terrifying and unfamiliar place, becomes misery itself. And I think that should remind you of Ayn Rand's own discussion of the nature of evil and the kind of way that evil takes place, where, the starting point is evasion. It's the turning off your mind, the turning away from reality, pretense, faking, and how that grows step by step, or can grow step by step, left uncorrected, into what ultimately is a metaphysical hatred of existence. And I think Peterson gets a lot about that process. And I think it's a valuable, I really love the way that he formulates some of that. If you don't believe in brick walls, you will still be injured when you run headlong into one. Then you will curse reality itself for producing the wall. I think that gets the issue completely. A word on white lies. And so Sam Harris's book was really interesting. I don't agree with everything in it, but it was really pleasurable to read alongside. So the objectivist approach it's deeply philosophic. And I've often talked about how there's a real value in getting kind of a more common sense take that's consistent with that broad principled perspective, but that makes it more real. So just as an example, I talked about the way in which reading Galt's speech and Ayn Rand's analysis of evil, it's really helpful to read her nonfiction, The Age of Envy, and you can see it in more kind of everyday terms. And I think Harris's book did that. Now, he's focused in large part on the issue of white lies because he thinks these are the ones people are most tempted to engage in. Now, remember, just to remind ourselves, this is what Leonard's analysis is. He says, the ethical status of a lie is not affected by the identity of its intended beneficiary. A lie that undertakes to protect other men from the facts represents the same anti-reality principle as the con man variety. It is just as immoral and just as impractical. A man does no service to his fellows by becoming their accomplice in blindness, nor does he gain any moral credit thereby. An improper practice is not improved by attaching to it an altruistic justification. And so I really liked how Sam Harris fleshes out really just this point in a really relatable way. He says, your friend looks fat in that dress, or any dress, because she is fat. So the whole context is that perennial, question of how do you answer somebody when they say, do I look fat in this dress? So he goes on to say, let's say she is also 35 years old and single, and you know that her greatest desire is to get married and start a family. You also believe that many men would be disinclined to date her at her current weight. And marriage aside, you are confident that she would be happier and healthier and would feel better about herself if she got in shape. A white lie is simply a denial of these realities. It is a refusal to offer honest guidance in a storm. Even on so touchy a subject, lying seems a clear failure of friendship. And later on he has, this is my favorite quote in the book, and I think just one of the best insights about lying that I've ever heard. He says, when we presume to lie for the benefit of others, we have decided that we are the best judges of how much they should understand about their own lives, about how they appear, their reputations, or their prospects in the world. And so if you just think about it in those terms, it is something that dresses itself up as kind of harmless and good-hearted and kind-hearted. His view, and I think this is right, is that it shows a real, if not contempt, a insulting view of other people that you supposedly respect and care about, and therefore, white lies are, I think they deserve the kind of condemnatory thing that you see in Leonard. And so we can say it's in a certain way understandable that people don't want to hurt the feelings of people that they like, respect, admire, or love, but that if we really think about it a little bit more deeply, like it should be all the more urgent to be honest with these people out of respect for the fact that, yes, they are capable of dealing with reality. And one of the most helpful things in dealing with reality is if a friend can bring to light facts that you're not aware of or that you're not totally 100% aware of. One final point on this. So Jordan Peterson has a discussion of what you could think of as like the psychology of honesty versus dishonesty. And this is not a point explicitly addressed by Rand, but I think it's true, and I think it's really profound. So he describes dishonesty as using words to manipulate the world into delivering you what you want. So it's, you have some end, and whether it's, he gives a list of things, imposing your ideological beliefs, proving you're right, appearing competent, increasing your status, getting a promotion, minimizing conflict, and on and on and on, right? And so it's you're going to try to manipulate those outcomes through your words and versus speaking the truth. Whereas, to be honest, in his view, it's almost like an act of faith. It says, I'm not going to try to manipulate outcomes. I'm just going to state the truth and come what may. I'm just going to trust that it's better than the alternative. And it's also for him, unfortunately, I think this is a really bad thing. It comes from his argument is sort of like the problem is that we should be more skeptical that what we're after for ourselves is really truly valuable. And that what will happen is, if we're honest, we'll get feedback on what's truly valuable over time. And I think from the objectivist perspective, it's not an act of faith to tell the truth, nor is it a response to skepticism about our ability to know what's truly valuable and what's truly good for us. It's that you know as a matter of principle that fidelity to reality is in your interest and that rational values depend on rational action. But what is true is that this mindset of like, I'm going to stop trying to manipulate outcomes and I'm going to just state the truth and let reality unfold as it will. I think that is psychologically a really helpful way to hold one's orientation in terms of honesty, or at least certainly in the issue of lying, which you can think about as kind of a sub-issue under honesty. And so the reason I wanted to go through all this is that I think it's just really interesting how many other thinkers have grasped a lot about honesty that Ayn Rand grasped, that what they don't have is they don't have it as a principle. I mean, there's a lot they don't have, but just on this issue, it's they don't have it as a principle that the facts, that dishonesty doesn't change the facts and therefore put you at war with reality, and certainly not the philosophic roots of this. And as a result, that they don't have it as a principle, part of what that means, as I've kind of touched on or indicated a little bit, is that they're too narrowly focused on lying and typically focused on lying to other people. And that for Rand, honesty is about something much wider and much more demanding. It's so much more demanding than just not lying to other people. It's a dedication to truth, to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, including that you're actively working to discover and live by the truth. And so, it's a great starting point not to tell lies. But if you just sit around and don't think about anything, but you don't happen to like throw out a whole bunch of like garbage and truths to people, you're still not living up to the virtue of honesty by the objectivist account. So I want to talk about what I think is one of the more difficult issues in the objectivist ethics and possibly in the whole objectivist philosophy, and that is Ayn Rand's statement that honesty is the recognition of the fact that the unreal is unreal and can have no value, that neither love nor fame nor cash is a value if obtained by fraud. I think most people can get, I can see how love obtained by fraud, that's not very good. It wouldn't have any particular meaning for me. And even fame, well, it seems to have some pretty good ancillary benefits, even if you obtain by fraud. But I mean, you're still like, it's not your achievements that you're being celebrated for, and it could always come back to bite you in some way, and that would be pretty embarrassing or worse. But cash, I mean, like, it's cash. Like, all else being equal, it'd be good to have money, right? It spends just as well, no matter where you get it from, right? And I think it's really hard to get Ayn Rand's view in a non-rationalistic way, and that is because, as we're going to see, the reasoning behind her conclusion counts on the deepest ideas in metaphysics and epistemology. So I'm going to do my best to try to make it as relatable as possible, more grounded as possible, to really flesh it out. But I think this is an idea worth spending some time on, just for yourself to get really clear on, because I think it no pun intended, or I guess intended, it holds a lot of cash value, this idea, but it takes a lot of work to get. So I would say a good place to start with this is just at the getting that when a person raises as kind of an objection, like, all right, you're an egoist. Why shouldn't you rob a bank if you think you can get away with it? What they're counting on is looking at that choice out of context. They're trying to pose a single decision, rob this bank, when it just seems like you got great odds and you're going to, get a lot of money. And that if you recall our discussion with integrity from the objectivist perspective, there's no such thing as just a single choice. Every choice has grounds for it, and therefore those grounds imply a certain policy. So what we're really choosing between is different policies. Should I act on the policy of honesty or on the policy of robbing, banks or anything else when it seems like a pretty safe bet I won't get caught? And you can think, though, that it's even wider than that, because what is the policy of robbing whenever it seems like a good plan? What does that imply? Well, it implies rejecting honesty, yes, but what about integrity? Well, I can't go around saying, hey, I'm pro bank robbery. Like, that would kind of give me up pretty quickly. So I have to get rid of integrity. What about justice? Well, this is a complete act of injustice. They earned it and I'm taking it. So I have to get rid of justice. What about productiveness? Well, at least insofar as I'm going to orient my life around being a bank robber, that productiveness is out. Oh, and so you can see the way in which what I'm really choosing between is not even just one principle versus another, but ways of life. Virtue, Leonard cites Socrates, is one. And so what's really we're being asked to choose between are two completely different ways of life. Recall our discussion that we kicked off ethics with under the good. That ethics begins by observing that people live different kinds of lives. Some seem more successful, efficacious, happy, energetic, and others are completely devoid of passion, success, competence. And what ethics is really doing is trying to conceptualize the principles, the goals, the methods, and the outcomes of these different kinds of lives. And so it's helpful to think in terms of like real people, or at least you can think also in art of artistic projections of that kind of bring to reality, that concretize different types of lives. And I mean, it's always great when you can use Ayn Rand's novels. In this case, though, because she doesn't really have any villains who are kind of just your normal run-of-the-mill bank robbing criminals, at least none that occurred to me. Maybe there's some minor characters in We the Living I'm not thinking of. But the what I see this issue as is I'm being asked, what is more selfish, the life of a Steve Jobs or the life of a Bernie Madoff? I think that really is the kind of decision that is being posed when somebody says, why not rob banks? Why not rob a bank if you can get away with it? So I think that already clarifies the issue in kind of a very, let's put it, non-rationalistic way. But it still doesn't tell us exactly why Ayn Rand thinks that the cash is not of value. But I think it gets us in the right mindset for answering that question and keeps us really connected to the reality of that question. That what we're trying to answer is, why is it selfish to live the life of a Jobs and not the life of a Madoff? That's really what is under the surface. Is why is the cash that a Madoff got not actually even a value to him? Now, there's really one answer to this, but I find it helpful to kind of break it up into its metaphysical aspect and its more epistemological aspect. So the metaphysical point is that conformity to reality is the precondition of remaining in reality. And so nothing that clashes with reality can be of value. Nothing that's anti-reality can be that which sustains you in reality. So this is how Leonard puts the point. The man who seeks to obtain a value through faking is confronted by one fundamental obstacle, that which exists, i.e., the particular facts he is struggling to erase or rewrite. In the nature of the case, his policy creates a dichotomy between fact and desire. Implicitly, it raises value above that which exists and thus represents a breach with reality. And that's, I mean, if you think about what's captured by the Madoff example versus the Jobs example, I mean, Madoff was somebody at war with reality. So he's trying to cover up a fact, which is that he didn't invest people's money and get great returns. It's that, well, we don't know exactly what he did with it, but it's that he didn't invest it. It's gone. There are no returns, and that he was breaking the law. And in order to cover up these facts, he had to tell more and more lies. And you get a kind of spiraling of lies, and you get somebody literally at war with reality where everything is a threat until ultimately it blew up in his face. Jobs, on the other hand, is somebody who experienced challenges, setbacks. And again, I'm talking about Jobs, as qua producer. His personal life, I think, is, a more complicated case. But, qua producer, this is somebody who experienced setbacks and failures, but he was not at war with reality. And so he was able to learn from his mistakes, and he was able to come back and achieve some of the greatest achievements in the history of business. And if you look at like the fact that, he worked until he literally couldn't work anymore. And it's not because he needed the money. It was because this is somebody clearly loved his work, had passion for it, passion for his life. And if you contrast that with somebody like Madoff, as I do in my article, this is somebody who set aside passion for his job, which he did not have. He didn't have passion for being a free man walking around. He described himself once he got arrested as it was a big relief, because at least now, I don't have to carry the burden of juggling all those lies and waiting for the other shoe to drop. So why not rob a bank if you think you can get away with it? Because you're going to war with reality, and your whole life, even if you never get caught by some accident, and it is an accident because you're in principle, those facts are out there to be discovered, and people are actively looking to discover them if you're going around robbing them, and they're actively looking to destroy you if you're going around hurting them. But even if you don't by some accident get caught, it's that the whole relationship you have with reality and with other people has changed. Far from reality now being a source of rewards and empowerment, and your relationships with others being a boon, all of that becomes turned against you. And so psychologically, it's your life is experienced as, and even set aside guilt, which, it's not all of these people have, though it's surprising how many do, and how many will confess to their crimes. But it's, even if you set aside that, you're still filled with tension, fear, anxiety, a sense of being out of control. Like every time you see somebody whispering, are they whispering about me? What do they know? Your whole orientation is suspicion, relief when they go away. That's the kind of state that you're putting yourself into, versus somebody who's, you could put it, at peace with reality. They might have a lot of bad stuff going on in their lives. Hopefully they have a lot of great stuff, but even when things are going bad, they're at peace with themselves and with the world. They're in touch with the world. The world is not, there's not kind of lurking threats to them out there, and threats that they've created through their own actions. So that's the more metaphysical perspective. Then we get the more epistemological perspective, which amounts to values are objective. So if we say the course of action that involves trying to gain values, dishonesty, puts you at war with reality, and nothing that comes as part of the package of going to war with reality is not a value. Here we get the idea of that nothing that is not reached as a value through an objective mental process is a value. So why do people think it's just self-evident that cash is good for you? Well, what we get is that they have to have one of two basic grounds. One is it's just intrinsically valuable. Like, obviously this is good. You don't have to do any mental processing. It's just self-evident. The other is that its value is subjective. It's whatever you happen to desire, or whatever society finds desirable, that makes it a value. And from the objectivist perspective, it's No, values are objective. That they're the product of a mental process of evaluation by a certain reality-based standard. And what they're doing in just treating this cash as self-evidently a value is literally the same thing somebody does when they treat a conclusion as that they haven't engaged in an objective process to reach as knowledge or even as possible. Remember our whole discussion of the arbitrary. The arbitrary is you don't actually go through the mental processing to bring an idea in relationship to reality in order to grasp its relationship, positive or negative, to reality in your mind. And that the result is that something that is unprocessed in that way for you is neither true nor false. It's worse than the false. It has no relationship to reality at all. And what Leonard argues is that a value that has something that might be a value, but from which you have not engaged in processing, you've not evaluated it by a rational standard, that is not a value. That it's neither a value nor a disvalue. You have no clue whether it's good for your life or bad for your life. What is true is that the process of acting in such a way that you're pursuing things that you haven't processed, you haven't rationally evaluated, that is clearly bad for your life. And this is the whole discussion that we went through in our discussion of man's life about man's need for principles. That for something to be a value means that it's overall good for your life, long range and wide range. In the full context of your life, it's life promoting. And that the only way to grasp that is to conceptualize the requirements of human survival. And the person who says, no, the money is self-evidently good, what they're in effect doing is saying, I don't need principles. I can live by the seat of my pants. And so what's really being offered to the person who says, well, the money's obviously valuable, it's just a question of whether you get caught or not. What they're really saying, in effect, is to hell with morality. You don't need morality. You don't need principles in order to figure out what's good for you. You can just judge it perceptually or by your feelings. There's no intellectual work that's required to establish it. And from Objectivism's perspective, that way of living, which amounts to kind of whim worship, perceptual level, short range mentality, that is a deeply destructive way of living. And again, we cover this in depth when we talked about man's life. But here's how Leonard puts it. And this is, he thinks, and I think he's right, one of the most powerful integrations in OPAR. Just as in epistemology, irrational mental processes detach a conclusion from the realm of cognition, so in ethics, irrational action detaches a goal from the realm of evaluation. Whenever an object, spiritual or material, is sought or obtained by behavior in conflict with moral principle, whether this behavior involves fraud, improper compromise, the initiation of force, or any other evil, the means employed by their very nature clash with reality and thereby deprive the object in that context of any evaluative standing. Once the guidance of principle is dropped, there is no rational method of evaluating an object. So you can't say the cash is a value because you haven't engaged in the thinking to decide that it's a value. You haven't brought it into relationship to a whole code of virtues and values, of abstract virtues and values, and thought, yes, this fits the kind of way of life that can sustain itself over the course of a human lifespan. It's completely arbitrary. And if you live that way, if you don't conceptualize the requirements of human survival, if you don't bring potential specific values into a relationship with a whole conception of your life and of the principles that govern it, that is self-destructive. And so the basic answer to why is cash obtained by fraud not a value is because reason is man's basic means of survival. So one last issue I want to go into, and that is virtues as contextual absolutes. And the best way to introduce this, I think, is with reference to the Kantian view, which the Kantian view is basically that honesty, or at least not lying, that's a categorical imperative. You have a moral obligation to tell the truth to everyone under every conceivable circumstances, even if it's going to get them killed, even if it's going to get you killed. That's what morality demands. And I mean, like so many things, Kant was, he was basically just echoing or dressing up, you could say, the Christian view that went at least back to Augustine, who said that lying is always sinful. And, we can rank lies and make distinctions among lies, but no, lying is just inherently a sin, and you're not supposed to do it regardless of consequences. And you get the kind of subjective reaction to that says, this is ridiculous. Nobody can live by that. And only like a psychopath would think that, yeah, you should tell the Nazis, hey, yeah, there's a bunch of Jews in my cellar, go on and find them. And that's moral. And so, as so often happens, is we have this kind of false alternative, right? Where it's, on the one hand, we have intrinsicism that has dogmas without context, and then we have subjectivism that says take everything on a case-by-case basis, and in neither way do we have real guidance for how to live. And objectivism's view is that you can't run your life through dogmas, you have to use principles. But principles, like all knowledge, are contextual. That is, they're grasped in a certain context, and therefore they only apply in that context. And so you don't take things case by case, that within that context, the principles are absolute. But then if you're dealing with a change in context, then it's not, then you have to think about, okay, well, what are the relevant considerations in this context, which is not where my principles are formed. And so, if you have an emergency, so if you think about principles are guiding you in the long range choices and actions, that are going to govern your life. Well, if you're not free to make those choices, if you're living in a dictatorship, that's just not what principles were designed to govern you in. And if you're thinking about an emergency situation where it's like, we need immediate action to avoid an immediate physical crisis right now, or, we're going to be dead or close to it. That's not what principles are designed for. Principles are designed when you can act on considered judgment for long-range purposes. They're designed as, this is the path to values. And that's a different path than, well, what about when somebody's trying to destroy my values or seize them or take them, whether it's a Nazi knocking at my door or the kind of snoop who's just trying to get something that they're not entitled to. And so I think a good, here's a good parallel maybe that will help if this seems like an unusual or foreign idea. Take the principle that force is anti-mind. Like, that's a principle of objectivism, but that doesn't imply that under no conceivable circumstances should you use force. In fact, it points precisely to when you should use force. If you're using force to gain a value or to destroy a value, then no, that you're initiating force, and that is contemptible. But if you're using force to protect values from a destroyer, well, that's a different context. That's not where the principle of the evil of force, that's not what it's, that's not the context in which you're forming it. So it's you need to take into account the context, and I've given some considerations for the context for honesty. As following Leonard, I'm not going to try to outline every conceivable issue that could come up. But one danger I do want to point out, so I mentioned the issue of snooping and lying to a stoop, which Leonard talks about, is I think he's right. I think it's totally legitimate. If somebody is trying to get a value from you that they're not entitled to, you're not pursuing anything from them. There's no moral issue with lying, but I do think this is an issue where you need to be very honest with yourself about your own, what you could think of as your moral psychology, which is that the less clear-cut the line is between the context of lying to gain a value versus lying to protect a value that's under attack, the less clear cut it is, the more you can potentially open the doors to rationalizations. So, I mean, it doesn't take much imagination to think of like, all right, there's a guy who says, yeah, I just lied to my girlfriend about who I'm texting because I'm just protecting my privacy. Whereas, no, what you're really trying to do is gain the value of the relationship with your girlfriend while secretly texting your ex in ways that your current girlfriend would say, no, that's unacceptable. So now that's I think, more obviously corrupt one, but I think it's something you really have to be honest with yourself. And I think there's a whole issue that is really fascinating to think about that isn't confined to moral issues, about the kind of what's legitimate versus what can you actually practice. So, for instance, in diet, it might be that like the kind of theoretical ideal diet would be, you eat healthy 3 meals and then you have a little snack, and that mental reward can kind of add pleasure to your life and everything like that. But if you're like me at all, having one small snack, that is kind of a non-starter. Like if I'm going to have a little bit of a snack, I'm going to have a lot of a snack. And so if I'm going to concoct, a diet plan for myself, it's going to be something much more likely, 6 days of being kind of like perfect, perfectly healthy. And then, either a meal or more likely a whole day of just, all right, it's deuces wild and whatever you want. And so what I'm saying is that even though you might be entitled to lie in certain cases, that you have to think about yourself and think about, does this for me open the door to a gray zone that could lead to rationalizing or real dishonesty? And if so, like maybe I should just sit, my view will be, I'm either going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, or I'm just going to say no comment, none of your business, and accept that maybe some people will read into that negatively. I think that's a choice that each person has to make. All right, so we've gone really long in this one, but I haven't gotten to tips. But thankfully, my main tip on how to cultivate honesty is to watch a talk by Gina Gorlin on how to cultivate honesty. This is called Earning Your Own Trust, The Psychology of Honesty. It's one of the best talks I've ever seen by an objectivist thinker, and a really courageous talk. She shares kind of her own struggles with honesty, reads from some of her personal journals, and gives really usable advice on how to cultivate honesty. And I think it's just magnificent. I hope everybody listens to it, and I hope I remember to link to it in this video. If I didn't, do me a favor, email me at don@donswriting, and I'll add it. That's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. And as always, the best way to stay in contact is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.